The NBA represents the pinnacle of professional basketball. Fast-paced, exhilarating, and filled with genetic specimens that bring a different type of excitement to the game. Just like in many other sports, pro basketball players are mostly good guys, but there's always a few that go out of their way to tarnish the reputation of the league. Shooting and stealing on the court turns to shooting and stealing off the court. Hitting threes turns into hitting your girlfriend. I think you catch my drift here. Without further ado, let's jump into the NBA's all-jail team from 2000 to 2023. We'll start things off with Metta World Peace, aka Ron Artest, a guy you'd never expect to make this list based on his last name. Despite being an advocate for several good things, Metta World Peace had his fair share of disciplinary and legal issues. In 2003, Metta destroyed a TV camera at Madison Square Garden, which resulted in a 3-game suspension. Shortly after this, he got into an altercation with Miami Heat coach Pat Riley, which resulted in another short suspension. The most famous incident of all is still referred to today as the Malice at the Palace. During a game between the Pacers and the Pistons in 2004, Ben Wallace and World Peace got into a scuffle which resulted in fans getting involved. A Pistons fan threw a cup of Diet Coke at Metta World Peace, and almost immediately, Metta jumped into the stands and confronted the fan. He punched the fan who he thought was responsible for throwing the Coke, and ultimately the game had to be stopped because of the brawl. The ordeal resulted in an 86-game suspension on top of fines and community service. The only real legal trouble Metta World Peace got into was in 2007 when he was arrested for domestic violence. He was sentenced to 20 days in prison and community service, while also being released by the Sacramento Kings indefinitely. Around the same time, he also had to give up possession of his dog due to accusations of malnutrition and neglect. Moving on, we have Javaris Crittenton, a former first-round pick who only played a few seasons in the NBA. Although not well known for his professional success, Crittenton made headlines when he was charged with murder in August of 2011. Shortly after his playing career was over, Javaris Crittenton was seeking revenge on a person who robbed him. He planned to shoot the guy, but sadly ended up targeting a 22-year-old mother by mistake. The woman died from her injuries, and a few days later, the FBI arrested Crittenton when he tried to board a plane at John Wayne Airport. Although he was originally released on bond, Crittenton eventually stood trial and pleaded guilty to voluntary manslaughter and aggravated assault with a firearm. This came after he was arrested for conspiracy to violate Georgia's Controlled Substance Act in 2014. He was sentenced to 23 years in prison, but ultimately he was released in April of 2023 after serving 10 years. The next player to make the team is J.R. Smith, a guy who had his fair share of violations throughout his long career. I'll preface this by saying that most of the trouble Smith got into was pretty minor. He started fights in games, got several traffic violations, and of course enjoyed smoking weed on a regular basis. Everything changed, however, when he got into a tragic car accident in June of 2007. Smith was driving with a friend in an SUV when he decided to blow a stop sign, causing him to crash into another car. As a result of the crash, Smith's car flipped over and caused serious injuries to his friend in the passenger seat. Unfortunately, his friend passed away a couple days after the crash, and J.R. Smith was charged for the crime. Smith did 24 days of jail time and 500 hours of community service, on top of a 7-game suspension. Next up is Jabari Bird, who had a short stint in the NBA before moving on to play professional basketball in Mexico. There's really nothing much to mention about Bird other than the fact that he assaulted and choked an ex-girlfriend of his in 2018. He also prevented her from leaving his apartment at the time, which resulted in a kidnapping charge on top of the obvious domestic violence. Unlike a lot of people who commit crimes, Jabari Bird actually admitted to what he did, and this likely helped in terms of his final sentencing. He was sentenced to 60 days of house arrest and 2 years of probation, while also being required to go through an abuse intervention program. The player to close out part 1 of this series is none other than Allen Iverson, a guy who arguably doesn't deserve to be mentioned. Most people know Iverson as one of the most prolific ball handlers of all time, but he also got into some trouble before his success in the league. While still in high school, Iverson and his friends were hanging out at a bowling alley and acting obnoxious as a lot of teenagers do. Eventually, a shouting match ensued between Iverson's group and another group of teens, and shortly after, a fight broke out. What happened next is controversial because Iverson allegedly struck a woman in the head with a chair. However, a video later surfaced which showed Allen leaving the scene shortly after the fighting began. Unfortunately, even though he likely wasn't involved, Allen Iverson was arrested and convicted as an adult with the felony charge of maiming by mob. He spent 4 months in a correctional facility prior to his conviction being overturned due to insufficient evidence. This was a situation where the justice system wanted to make an example of Iverson, but thankfully the public and his former coaches came to his defense. That wraps up part 1 of the NBA's all-jail team from 2000 to 2023. Be sure to stay tuned for the next part of this series. Thank you guys so much for watching. This has been Brad with DFS City, and we'll see you in the next one.